Welcome, everyone. My name is Linda Johnson. I'll be the host. Along with me, I have Gerald Johnson. We welcome you this evening. I'd like to share with you a little bit about who we are. The Charlotte Post Publishing Company, publisher of the Charlotte Post newspaper and the Triangle Tribune newspaper. We are a weekly community newspaper serving Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, and Cary, North Carolina. The Charlotte Post Publishing Company is minority owned and operated and has served as a dominant force in educating, empowering our community since 1878. Like I feel here an echo. We are a multimedia company specializing in print. Yes, there is still print, newspaper, electronic edition, social media, podcasts, and webinars such as this. And we are on all the social media platforms, and you'll see Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. So tonight, I'd like to welcome you to our virtual webinar, Turn Hope into Outcomes, an overview of cancer clinical trials, brought to you by the HOPA, Hematology Oncology Pharmacy Association. It is a pleasure to have each and every one of you joining us from various locations, right from the comfort of your own home or offices. Thank you for making time to be with us today. As we kick off today's session, I'd like to remind everyone of the power of learning and connecting even in a digital platform. Our webinar today promised to be both informative and enlightening. Write down any questions or concerns you may have, and don't be afraid to ask our panel of experts for further clarification. We have dedicated Q&A sessions after the presentations where your questions will be answered by being an active participant in this conversation. You are helping to raise awareness. Turn hope into time for clinical trials. And before we get started, we have a disclaimer I'd like to go over. You can take your time and read yourself silently there. And I want to thank you for your attention to this disclaimer, and we hope that you find our webinar engaging. So the objective of this webinar is to educate our community on cancer clinical trials. Cancer is a disease that touches all of our lives in some ways, but not everyone has had the same access to groundbreaking treatments and research. Together, we'll have the opportunity to change that. So we have experts of panelists this evening that will be going over various forms of information about clinical trials. And there'll be opportunity for you, again, to ask questions, as well as there will be a polling. There'll be a few pollings, so we would like for you to participate. And before we get started, we have some webinar etiquette. As we know, in this virtual space, sometimes there's delay, mute, you want to talk. However, we ask that if you freeze up, you go away, come back, we will continue our conversation. We will not stop. And that goes to the panelists as well. Sometimes we can't have control, of the mishaps with technology. So we'll be here waiting for you. And during these presentations, we'll have a Q&A time. And at this time here, we'd like you to place your questions in the Q&A. As you see a diagram on the slide here, that's where you will put your questions. and the panelists will answer those at the end. So tonight, I'd like to take the time and share with you who we'll have with us on our platform, no other than Gerald O. Johnson. He is our CEO, publisher of the Charlotte Post Publishing Company. And this time, I'd like to invite Gerald to our podium for remarks. Unmute yourself, Gerald, and come on.
Okay. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Good. It's always tricky to mute and unmute. But anyway, good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Let me start off by saying that the Charlotte Post Publishing Company is the leading producer of content about Black people, for Black people, and by Black people in North Carolina. And when we discovered that only 8% of Black people participate in counseled clinical trials, we recognize the urgency of addressing this issue. And as a result, we are making increasing that 8% a top priority that we're going to focus on, because that, well, that's just unimaginable to me and the staff here. And so we're going to do what we can, and this is just a leading piece of what we're involved with in hosting this event. And so stay tuned and listen, and hopefully you can learn a lot and get other people involved in making a difference in this serious issue. That's all I have for now, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Gerald.
Think nothing of it.
And at this time here, I'd like to introduce to you all our moderator for the evening, Kamashi Wow, Director of Pharmacy for Oncology and Infusion Services, University of North Carolina, UNC Medical Center. And we'd like to thank you for being a part of this conversation this evening. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to you, Kamashi.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thanks, Gerald. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. My name is Kamakshi Rao. As Linda said, I am the Director of Pharmacy at UNC in Chapel Hill. So it's amazing and wonderful to share some space with friends and neighbors in the Charlotte and the Triangle area. I come to you this evening representing the Hematology Oncology Pharmacists Association. I'm joined by two co-speakers who I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. We want to take a moment to thank the Charlotte Post Publishing Company for hosting this and making time for what we think is a really important conversation, and giving space to us to share some information, hopefully dispel some myths, and encourage you to ask questions that can help you understand better how we can move the needle on inclusion in cancer clinical trials. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get us started. Can everybody see that okay? Awesome, wonderful. Technology. So I'd like to introduce to you, I am just the moderator, so I get to hold space and play MC for the evening. But I've got two amazing colleagues who are here to share their expertise and information with you. Our two lead speakers this evening are Dr. Catherine Kinsman and Dr. Jennifer Murphy. Dr. Kinsman is a pharmacist in investigational drug services at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle, Washington. And Dr. Murphy joins us from the UC Davis Health System in California, where she is the senior pharmacist in oncology and investigational drug services. Both Dr. Kinsman and Dr. Murphy bring a world of experience with them, both in the areas of cancer treatment, but most notably in clinical trials and how they are executed and what it means to participate in them. So they bring a really unique and important perspective to the discussion tonight. And I'm really, really happy to join them tonight. Over the coming 50 minutes or so, what we hope you walk away from this conversation with is, number one, What's the role of an oncology pharmacist? Many of you may be familiar with the pharmacists you see at your local retail drugstore. Maybe some of you know that pharmacists work in hospitals, but we're going to introduce you to a subset of pharmacists within hospitals who specifically focus in the care of cancer patients. And even more, how we help patients who may be enrolling in cancer clinical trials. We're going to walk through some history, acknowledge, where cancer clinical trials have been, how we have learned to do them better, and what we're committed to doing moving forward. We're going to talk about the who, what, when, and why, sort of getting into the details of what clinical trials are for, why they exist, what it looks like to participate in one, and what our responsibility as healthcare workers are to execute on those trials. And there's no pop quizzes, so I'll give you the hint at the very beginning. You have something to do with this. Hopefully you or someone you know may find this information really useful. One of my favorite things to do as a pharmacist is really dispel myths. A lot of people have a lot of really important views, and they have opinions about what it is to participate in clinical trials. We're here to talk about which parts of those are true and what are myths, and maybe we can bust some of those myths while we're together tonight. And last is just talking about how we open the dialogue to make people more comfortable with participating in clinical trials. I hope most of you will join me, submit questions as you have them. I will try and monitor the chat at the end and we'll answer those questions. Each of us on this panel tonight, and I'm sure those of you in the audience, have been touched by cancer in some way. And clinical trials are a way for us to continue to learn and service our patients to the best of our ability. So I'm really excited for you to join us and learn a little bit more from our panelists. So we're going to use some polling tonight, and that's to help us understand where you are as our audience and help us figure out how to craft our message a little better. We aim for this to not be a lecture, but a dialogue. We're going to have some conversation. So I'm curious if we can pull up the first poll. I'd love for our attendees to share with us, how often have you spoken to a pharmacist about your medications? This would be a pharmacist anywhere, in the hospital, in a retail setting. Is it A, routinely, like you are buddies with your pharmacist, you know where to find them and ask questions? Is it occasionally, just if you have a really important question or if you can't get a hold of your doctor? Or is it never? You're like, I really didn't know they were someone I should talk to. So go ahead and submit your vote. I'm going to give everybody about 30 seconds. There's no wrong answer here either. Everything is correct. We're just trying to see where most people land. Let's go ahead and see what answers we've gotten. Okay, you know what? That's about what we expect. So about a third of you pretty routinely, yay, talk to your pharmacist. That's amazing. And about 2/3 of you, which is totally reasonable, occasionally talk to your pharmacist. Now, for the 10% of you that have never talked to your pharmacist, we're pretty fun people to talk to. We're well informed and we definitely are here to serve. In fact, I would offer that I think pharmacists, one of the skill sets that pharmacists have that's pretty unique, is that we're really trained on how to talk to our patients in a way that helps them understand their medications and understand what's happening best. It is one of our secret sauces that we train our pharmacists in. So I encourage those of you who maybe don't tap into your pharmacist as often as you could to definitely consider doing so. Thanks for sharing your opinions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. And oh my gosh, I'm already forgetting who I'm turning it over to. I'm turning it over to Jen. Awesome. So I'm going to turn over the podium to Dr. Murphy to kick us off with some introductions. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Kamachi. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I am here to introduce you to your oncology pharmacist, and I'm one of them. And so we can go on to the next slide. So as oncology pharmacists, we are cancer medication experts. We are trained in how to treat cancer, and this involves a lot of years of training, but it gives us the ability to not only work with the doctors, the nurse practitioners, the nurses, but also our patients so that they can understand their medications. We work on the sidelines and behind the scenes to make sure that all of the medications you receive are correctly and personally dosed for you. And if you're experiencing side effects, we also work with your healthcare team to ensure that they're selecting the proper medications at the right dose and using the best options that are available for you and what's going on in your situation. And that's what we do for every patient, whether they're on a clinical trial or not. But for those who are in clinical trials, they get to know us a little bit better in some different ways because we just interact differently. As oncology pharmacists, we also participate in conducting research. So we are involved in clinical trials, and we are also involved in participate in quality and safety initiatives. So when we're not doing patient care, we may be working on projects in our limited spare time, but it's because we want to investigate. We want to find out on our own things that are going on. We maybe identified trends in our patients and we want to put data behind that. But we do also participate in clinical trials, and we'll be talking about that, of course, much more today. We as oncology pharmacists also manage high cost medications. And so we are a great resource if you have medications that you are finding unaffordable, the copays are high, you have no insurance or your insurance doesn't cover enough of the cost. Please reach out to your oncology pharmacist because we can help you access patient support. And so we do advocate for our patients. It's really important to us that our patients are receiving the best care, not only from a medication standpoint, but also the support that they need. One way that we support our patients is through patient education. And so we will provide counseling or medication education for you. We can help you maximize insurance reimbursements or trying to find alternative pharmacies or ways to lower the cost of your medications. We do a lot of reviews of your medications as well. So it's really important that you let your healthcare providers know if there's any herbs, supplements, medications, anything that you are really taking. That way we can compare that and how it works in the body and how the body interacts with that to the medications that you'll be receiving for your cancer treatment. Because we don't want anything to either decrease the efficacy of your cancer treatment or increase the side effects. We also are here to ensure that other healthcare providers and you know how to safely store your medication and handle it correctly so that you can minimize risk of exposure to other people that may be around you, your household, or different surfaces. And then, of course, we want you to know how to use your medication correctly so that you can get the best possible outcome. So we have this picture here, and it's kind of a little web, and it's really just to highlight all the different places where you may see an oncology pharmacist. So places that you may most commonly interact with an oncology pharmacist could be at your academic or community cancer center, maybe through a mail order specialty pharmacy. They may call you on the phone, do some counseling, ask some questions, set up delivery for your medication. It could be through your infusion center or retail pharmacy. We do also work in college of pharmacies to advance the careers of, or to, train future pharmacists. We work in information technology, so many different ways and places that oncology pharmacists can kind of integrate into healthcare and work to support patients. So we really are a work from anywhere medication expert doing anything from drug development to clinical trials to treatment management.
Jen, I'm curious if you could help our patients understand, like if someone's like maybe taking a loved one to a cancer appointment, or maybe they're going to see their doctor themselves and they don't know if there's a pharmacist around there. What's the best way for them to maybe ask and see whether they could talk to an oncology pharmacist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, whether you're seeing your nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, or the physician, you can always ask to speak to a pharmacist, and you can specifically ask for an oncology pharmacist. They'll let you know if one's available, or maybe how to schedule an appointment with them, or give them a call. Every place is a little different for how the pharmacist may be available to interact. So, all you need to do is just ask, and someone should be able to point you in the right direction. All right, so we have a couple of or a lot of words that'll pop up on the slide as we go. But talking about the impact of the oncology pharmacist, we can provide counseling for patients. And so we have medication sheets that may be created. For example, if you want to know about how to manage the side effects of nausea and vomiting, you could scan that QR code for reading later. But at the end of the day, what's most important and how we make the greatest impact is through patients allowing us to develop a relationship as a pharmacist and a patient. It helps us to get to know you better so that we can provide personalized patient care for you. It allows us to ensure that you know how to take your medications correctly, that we can have an open and honest conversation about how you're doing. Is affordability an issue? Is that even preventing you from getting the medications? If you're getting your medications, are you having side effects, and how we can help with that? And again, as I've mentioned before, we know that cost can be a barrier. And so we are here and well equipped to help you with cost savings. And so at the end of the day, our goal really is to make your treatment accessible to you and allow you to participate in your care as best as possible and really drive that patient satisfaction. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about cancer clinical trials. So another polling question: on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with the idea of participating in a clinical trial? And we just want, whatever your honest answer is. There's no right answer and no wrong answer here.
I'm going to leave that poll open for about 30 seconds. I want people to think about it. Sometimes you have to think about that. If someone were to tell you, hey, we have a clinical trial that might suit your needs or the needs of your loved ones, how comfortable are you that you'd know the answer would be, yeah, I'm really interested and I'm comfortable with what I know about them? Let's go ahead and close the poll and see where we shake out with our answers.
All right. Wow. No one said they're not sure. That's great. So 25% are very comfortable. That's amazing. Almost half said they're somewhat comfortable, 12% somewhat uncomfortable, and 18% very uncomfortable. And, every response is valid. I think it's unique for each individual and certainly in each situation. So I appreciate you sharing where you are on your comfort level. All right, one more. And again, no right answer, no wrong answer. In your opinion, what is the most common barrier to participation in clinical trials?
I would add that your feedback is really important as we get these answers. They help us as an organization. SAHOPA is an organization made up of oncology pharmacists, and your feedback helps inform what we do as an organization, how we feed into our education of our pharmacists and our community members. So really appreciate you sharing your opinion. Let's see how this answer played out as well.
Okay, number one. Oh, I apologize. Number one is lack of trust. Okay. I think that is certainly understandable, and we'll talk about that as the presentation goes on. Number two, lack of information. B and C are 3 and 4 are time and cost. Okay, thank you so much for sharing. I think this is going to be great to shape our conversation and where we're going. Next slide, please. All right, so what are cancer clinical trials? So, cancer clinical trials are clinical trials that focus on patients who have cancer. They help us to make new discoveries about disease prevention, detecting cancer, or treating cancer. And we really use the information that we get from these clinical trials, whether it's the data or observations that are made to educate healthcare providers and patients so that they can make decisions that are appropriate for that patient's care. When you participate in a clinical trial, there oftentimes are more checkpoints or touch points with your healthcare team. You may have to come in more frequently. So that certainly speaks to the time point or the time piece of that being a barrier to participation. And then they are highly regulated. So clinical trials undergo a lot of different steps. So they are reviewed by FDA. They then come to investigational review boards. And again, I'll touch on what that is in a couple of slides, but they're not just like we're, coming up with an idea and then just running wild with it. So when you see the word trial, you can just think about it in the thought process of like prolonged testing, but don't let that scare you.
Yeah. Jen, I was wondering if you or Catherine could comment. You talk about cancer clinical trials that are aimed at disease prevention and treatment. Knowing that there are all sorts of other trials that exist, could you maybe help our audience understand that trials are not always around like the treatment for cancer, but the experience of being a cancer patient as well?
Sure. So sometimes the trials may even just be survey-based. It may be asking the patient to answer questions about their experience with cancer, what the impact is on finances, time, caregiver situations, practical life concerns. It could also be, we have a couple of clinical trials here that are looking at supporting the patient. So maybe they're looking at how to decrease a certain side effect from cancer, like nausea or nerve damage or what we call peripheral neuropathy. So kind of that like finger tingling feeling, or, you might get it in your feet, your toes. So it's not just about treating the cancer, but also how do we improve the experience for patients as they undergo treatment as well, in a wide variety of ways.
And I would just add, we have some interesting ones here, looking at different apps. So how can technology help us to stop smoking potentially? Some non-therapeutic trials looking at, whether yoga impacts our quality of life while we're going through cancer treatment. So lots of different ways that we can study not just the treatment, but everything else that's going on around that trial.
Cancer patients are certainly more than their disease. So it's important that we look at the full picture for the patients.
Did I lose you guys for a second?
Looks like we lost the slide.
Okay, let me share that again. So sorry about that. Let me. There you go. So sorry. Is that better?
Do you mind to enlarge it? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay. So I think we're on the next slide now. Okay, now we're going to get into some myth busters. So again, if you want to scan this QR code, you can save that in your browser for later reading. And if you don't mind, yes, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of myths we're going to talk about, and then we'll go into reality. So the first one is I might get a placebo instead of real drug. So the reality is that everyone will get what is considered the same standard of care. So in cancer, we don't withhold treatment from anyone if just monitoring and not doing any intervention is the standard of care. It is possible that you could get that or that could be your course while you're on a clinical trial, but you're not going to get anything worse or inferior to what the standard and best practice is. So you could also get a new treatment or a placebo as well. Okay, the next myth is approved drugs are more effective than trial drugs. So the reality is that drugs we're investigating can be just as safe and effective as the standard of care drugs that you would receive if you weren't on a clinical trial. And the purpose of the whole clinical trial is to see, are these as safe and effective? And so that's the purpose of why we're doing the research at the end of the day. And the last one is I will be a guinea pig for trial drugs. So the reality is that these clinical trials have been well vetted, well researched, and so the physicians, the researchers, including your oncology pharmacists and other clinicians, are very well and highly trained to understand the side effects of these medications, the potential risks, how these study drugs may interact with your current medications, and other safety concerns. And so you may feel like you're a guinea pig because it could be, the first time that the drug is being used in a person, but I want to assure you that there are plenty of safeguards and checkpoints and monitoring in place so we can continue to monitor and make sure that you're safe. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So pharmacists in clinical trials, this is, I think, what Catherine and I do every day. We are here to get our sites ready to participate in clinical trials. So we read hundreds of pages. We figure out what the best way is to mix that medication at our site so that we can get you the drug as quickly and safely as possible. We review all of the orders that the physicians write for the study drug. So the pharmacists are looking at everything that the healthcare provider has prescribed for you. So there's always a second set of eyes from the pharmacist on it. We also help assess patients for enrollment in clinical trials. So it may be that we're looking at your medications that you take for whatever other things you have going on. So maybe you have high blood pressure or diabetes. We're going to look at those medications and see how they interact with any medications you would need to take when you're on the clinical trial. We will do education for you about your study medications or answer any questions you have about medications. And then we may participate on the institutional review board, which is a safety check. So some of the commonly asked questions of pharmacists include, and these are all questions that we encourage you to ask an oncology pharmacist, are how often do I take my medications? How long is my infusion? What side effects should I know about? And are there other meds that I need to avoid while on study? So this is just a quick list that I encourage you to take a screenshot of if you ever aren't sure what to ask your pharmacist about or you're trying to get more information and need a starting place. But at the end of the day, we're happy to answer any questions you have, regardless of what they are. So whether it's about your cancer meds or other medications you're taking or supplements, please feel free to ask. We're always here for you.
I'm curious, some of our audience members might not know how much training an oncology pharmacist gets to make them, really that source of dependable information. So could you maybe speak to, like, if someone's training as an oncology pharmacist, how do we make sure that they know what they're talking about when a patient asks them questions like this?
Great question. So I can tell you about my situation or what my story is, and then I can kind of share how things have changed a little bit over time, but for what's common. So I went to college for 4 years, and then I went to pharmacy school for 4 years, and then I did a 1-year clinical training residency in the hospital. So it was an acute, meaning like urgent or hospitalization type situation for patients. So I did an acute care training. So I took care of patients in the hospital. And then I did a whole year of training specifically in oncology patients. So what's very common today is that the pharmacists go to college, they go to a 3 or 4 year pharmacy school, depending upon how long school is. And then they do a general year of training that's either in the hospital or maybe in clinics. And then they do a whole year of training specifically in oncology so that we know exactly how to take care of our oncology patients.
Yeah, that's right. And some of our oncology training programs, they actually require that anyone who's training to be an oncology pharmacist get exposure to clinical trials and investigational drugs, because you all know, you hear about new cancer drugs coming out, it seems like every other week. And when you hear about them, you have to wonder, how do we stay up to date with it? And that's part of our training as oncology pharmacists, is to learn how to keep up with that data and all those trials that are going on so that we can be good resources for our patients. Thanks, Jen.
Okay. And of course, we need to have trust. I think that we'd be naive to ignore history in this conversation, and Catherine will talk about that a little bit more. But trust is earned. It is not something that is given, especially in the BIPOC community when talking about clinical trials. And so we need to work to earn your trust. I encourage you to challenge your healthcare providers, ask the hard questions, ask them to give you the answers. Everything about clinical trials and your treatment should be built around transparency, and that's based on honest conversation. So we encourage you to ask the questions that you want to know. You deserve the answers to the questions you have so that you can make an educated decision about the care that you'll receive. And that may be including questions of, and part of why we want to have this conversation today of, how many patients that participated in this clinical trial look like me? How many patients in this clinical trial had comorbidities that are something that I have? How is this clinical trial data representative of a patient like me? And so, part of how we get there is through participation from your community. But again, we have to earn the trust for you to want to enroll. So ask the questions. Don't be afraid. They can be hard, they can be easy. Whatever you want to know, you have the right to ask. And so in part of how we build trust is through the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. You've heard me mention this a few times today already. The Institutional Review Board serves to protect patient rights. They are reviewing the protocol, any submitted manuals, they're reviewing the informed consent. They're going through really with a fine-tooth comb with the intention of protecting your patient rights. They are going to review the risks, what type of ongoing monitoring will exist, and really they're having conversations about, is this appropriate? Is this not appropriate? Should there be more? Do we need to go back to the sponsor and ask questions? They also want to make sure that what is provided to you as the patient is done with clear communication. So are you aware of what's needed to enroll on the trial? Is the informed consent, which sometimes can be a 30-page document that they're asking you to review and sign if you're enrolling, is it written in a way that is understandable to every person? Is it written in the language that the person can receive the information? And so the IRB really does serve to really champion for patients. They also work with teams to make sure that they're going to be recruiting appropriately for the study as well. And so my last slide today to talk to you is about support. So I think if you take a second to reflect on the answers that that you all identified as barriers to participating in clinical trial, information, time, these are all important things, and life is complicated. Like, I don't think there's any person on this call who would maybe argue otherwise. And so, we are busy people. So the amount of time that you have available to give to a clinical trial can differ. There are some clinical trials that just may only be a couple weeks of involvement, and it may be years. It really differs. And so you want to ask what the time involvement will be when you consider participating, and it can change over the course of the trial too. Some of the visits might be at your house. They could be at a site you have to travel to. So those are important questions as well. And there may be support available for you for flexibility, or in from the perspective of social or financial support, because we know that insurance may not cover everything, or the trial may not cover all costs. And so it's important too that you ask if there's any financial support that can be provided. And trials do cover a lot of costs, but not everything necessarily is covered. Routine care, like lab draws, or maybe you're getting fluids or something, may be billed to insurance, but there can be financial assistance programs available as well. And then lastly, social support. So the psychosocial emotional component of this cannot be neglected. Patients, they invest a lot of time when they're enrolled in a clinical trial. And so again, if you need assistance with travel or lodging, some sponsors will provide that to the patients. We want to make sure that we're supporting you emotionally as well. So, whether it's a therapist or a social worker or someone, please let us know if you need that. And then lastly, it's really important, and I think HOPA is working to advance this, is caregiver support. I think if you are the loved one of someone with cancer, it can, the caregiver can often be forgotten in this. And so I think it's important that you champion for those people as well. And so those are just some different ways that support can be provided for patients and their families, for you if you're participating in a clinical trial. All right, and now I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Jen. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I get to transition to talking about kind of what is involved in a clinical trial if you enroll in one. and why clinical trial participation is so important for everybody. So first, I want to look back and review some historical trials and some examples of times where we were not conducting ethical research practices and how we've changed in response to those early trials. And this is a little bit of a heavy topic, but I think it's really important as part of our commitment to transparency and honest communication. It starts in 1932 with the Tuskegee research study, which continued for about 40 years. Black men were recruited to study the natural course of syphilis, and they were not consented to the trial. And when antibiotics became available, they were not offered treatment. In 1951, a Black woman named Henrietta Lacks in Baltimore had her tumor removed, and her cells were used for research without her knowledge, and again, without her consent. So both of these trials illustrate unethical practices, no consent, withholding treatment, things that would absolutely not be tolerated today. And as a result of these studies, standards were created and published, the Belmont Report in 1979, the Helsinki Declaration in 1964, and these set requirements for ethical research and how we respect everybody that's on trial today. Next slide, please. So cancer affects everyone, all of us, regardless. It doesn't distinguish. And in part because of the history that I talked about on the last slide, not everyone has had the same access to the latest treatments. And to share some data around this, in 2020, 75% of clinical trial participants were white. Only 11% were Latino, and as Gerald mentioned in the beginning, 8% were Black and about 1% were Indigenous. So this really, really hurts our communities, because when a drug becomes FDA approved, we only know how to use it in a portion of the population. And so we don't know how to use it in every population for every person. So what we really need is for our clinical trial representation to match the representation in the US, in our local communities, so that we have a more complete picture of how well a drug works for absolutely everyone. And we really need historically underrepresented populations like Black, Indigenous, and people of color to get access to the most advanced treatments.
Catherine, I'm gonna throw a question to you from the Q&A from the chat box, and it's a really good one, and I wouldn't say it's an easy one. So Celeste put a question in the chat, so I think we can share some responsibility for answering this if we'd like. She said, you know, with DEI initiatives facing challenges and some changes in healthcare service landscapes, do we think that those two things, so the change to the face of DEI as well as administrative changes in the nation, do we anticipate these two things having an impact on advancing clinical trial diversity?
Ooh, that's a hard question.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. I'd like to think that some of the safeguards we've put in place with the IRBs and our commitment, I can speak to my own, experience on an IRB, that will be independent of finance or politics or culture, and that we've put enough safeguards in place that hopefully we will be not influenced by those cutbacks. But I think we should be aware of that, aware of the concern, and we need to actively work against that and continue to reach out to communities and make sure that our clinical trials are matching our populations in our areas, and hold the researchers accountable when they come back through the IRB to see if we're doing a good job, and then halt the trial if it's not effectively representing our communities.
Yeah, 100%, right? And I would say, like, the only thing I would add is, I think the funding that comes through the National Cancer Institute, the NCI, which is sort of like the nation's central oversight for cancer therapies and trials, is really well run, and it's really led by scientists who are leaders in their field, and they really are working towards a shared endpoint. I do think that most of the time when you talk to individual practitioners, organizations, regardless of what the environment is around us, there is a concerted effort to make sure that patients have access to the best care possible. And sometimes that best care includes the option for a trial. One of HOPA's core tenets is a pursuit of health equity and patient advocacy. So it's part of the reason that we're here, is to make sure that regardless of things that are affecting our environment, we remain committed to making sure that representation is pursued in clinical trials.
So with all of that background, that brings us to today and our current ethics. So our approach to your participation in clinical trials will absolutely start with trust. I'll echo what Jen said. You have to ask us the hard questions. We will focus on keeping you safe. We will make participation as easy and as accessible as possible. And we promise to spend time with BIPOC patients and their caregivers to understand each other better. Every clinical trial today is designed with your safety as the absolute #1 priority and is monitored by a review board to make sure that happens. So now we can talk about what is involved. What's it going to look like if you agree to be part of a clinical trial? You will have screening tests and procedures. We need to make sure that you meet the criteria, that what we're studying, that you're the right fit for that. So that might involve pictures of your tumor or of your body. It might involve procedures or getting a biopsy of that tumor. It will likely involve innovative treatments, things that we have reason to suspect will be better than the status quo. Probably surveys, because we also want to know whether we are impacting your quality of life for better or for worse. You'll get regular checkups with monitoring. I like this because sometimes in the healthcare system, I feel like everybody's on the clock and there's short visits, and this is an extra set of eyes on my care and an extra person that I can call if I have questions. And lab work, including follow-up labs. So one of the things we need to study when we have a new drug is to see how it gets cleared from the body. So we will give you a drug, for example, at 9 a.m., and then we're going to check your blood work at 10 and at noon and probably at 8 p.m. And so you definitely need to look at your informed consent and see, how often am I going to get lab draws, and is this going to work for my lifestyle? Is this clinical trial going to be a good fit for me? And then clinical trials involve commitment. Our commitment to make sure that we are being transparent about how the conduct of that trial is going and what the updates are, and then your commitment to continue on it so that we get data that's complete and not, cut short. But the most important thing I need you to leave here knowing is that clinical trial participation is always voluntary and that you can leave at any time. So if you decide to leave a clinical trial or if you decide not to participate, you will still get excellent care and there will be no consequences to your cancer treatment. I want to talk a little bit about informed consent because I think this is really important. There is a document that's created. It's reviewed by the IRB. It should be in really easy to understand language. And it is an agreement where you sign and say, I agree to be part of this clinical trial. And it's also a document that gives you all of the information about it. So it's a very detailed description about what the risks are, but also what the potential benefits are to society and to you, and what is going to be done at every single step of the way. So on day 1, you're going to get labs, and on day 3, you're going to get an infusion, and then you're going to get labs again. And so all of that detail is there so that you can decide if it's a good fit for you. These documents get updated as we get new information throughout the trial, so you'll probably get several of them over the course of time that you participate in a trial. And I would always keep the last version of it that you have, because they usually have a phone number on it. They always have a phone number on it, so that you can contact your provider, or if you want to stop the trial, you can easily say, I want to stop. There's no red tape or hoops to jump through. You just call and say, no, thank you. And then the first time you're going to see this document is when someone comes up to you and says, we'd like you to think about being on this clinical trial, and they will give you an informed consent, and you can take that home and review it with all the time that you need. So no one will ever be rushing you to sign a document that you haven't had time to review with your friends and family. There are a lot of people involved in a clinical trial. Like I said, this is great. I like it. I get a lot of attention. It takes a team. So that includes you as the participant and also your caregivers and support people. It involves the researchers designing the new innovative treatment, healthcare providers like pharmacists, doctors, nurses, research coordinators, and interpreters. Cancer clinical trials take place everywhere. hospitals, clinics, academic medical centers, smaller community hospitals, specialized research centers that only do research. And what I'm seeing as the trend in my institution is care closer to home. So about half of our trials are oral therapy, and a lot of them are working on new therapies that can be given as an injection under the skin that the patient can give to themselves, or different ways that patients can take medications at home. So there may be a trial that's a really good fit for you that is actually studying whether the care is as effective if you get it at home as coming into a clinic and having to spend time in a waiting room and at the doctor's office, which we know is time-consuming and frustrating. So hopefully today we have left you with a sense of why you should consider participating in a cancer clinical trial. We've talked about receiving expert care, accessing new treatments, and helping to advance medicine so that everybody in the community is represented and also you get the best possible care, including the next new thing. And that we've talked about connecting with support systems, that clinical trials can help you get more support and support for your caregivers as well.
Catherine, there's one question I meant to ask you a couple slides ago, and I'm sorry I forgot to do it then. You were talking about like monitoring and upkeep with, when someone's enrolled on a trial. I wonder, sometimes the feedback we get from patients is, what if I get on a trial and someone figures out like an answer to that trial because they're looking at the safety data? Do I have to stay on my treatment if the person who's running the trial already knows that it's either better than or not as good as? So could you talk to some of those like early stopping rules and how we make sure that patients have access to the best treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important for people to know, is that most protocols are built in with evaluation points for safety and efficacy, and also routine monitoring. So someone comes out to my site at least once a month for every single trial and says, hi, I want to look at all your data. And they take that back and compile it all. And then they have rules. If we hit this many people that are not benefiting, if we hit this many people that are benefiting, we need to open it up, tell everybody what they've been receiving, if there's any kind of placebo or, hidden aspect to it. They will tell everyone what they've been receiving, and then they will offer everyone the therapy that is better. If we discover that a therapy that we had really high hopes for has not improved anything, then we will take folks off as soon as possible so that they can move on to the next standard of care or the next clinical trial that might be a better fit for them at that point.
Yeah, thanks for going through that. I think that's really important.
Sure. So we have a link here in case you want more information. This is the 4 W's of cancer clinical trials, the who, where, what, and why. You can scan that QR code and mark it in your browser for you to look at later. And we get to do another audience engagement question. So before today, how familiar were you with the role of oncology pharmacists in cancer care? A, very familiar, B, somewhat familiar, or C, not familiar at all?
So go ahead and answer what you thought of oncology pharmacists in terms of familiarity before tonight. Hopefully we've done something to educate you about who we are and what our approach looks like. But what was your familiarity before? I'm going to give everybody about 10 seconds to answer this question. All right, let's see where the answers shook out. Yeah, that's fair. So about half were not familiar at all. We tend to work behind the scenes a lot, so sometimes might not be as clear that we're there, but promise we are. About half were somewhat familiar. Maybe they've heard of us, but maybe haven't interacted. And thankfully, we've got 2 really good friends in the audience who are really familiar with who we are and what we do. Oops, all right, let's go back. There you go.
Great. And so our last audience response question for tonight is, on a scale of 1 to 5, after what you've learned tonight, how comfortable are you with the idea of participating in a clinical trial? And same numbers as last time, with 1 being not sure, 2 being very uncomfortable, 3 being somewhat uncomfortable, 4 being somewhat comfortable, and 5 being very comfortable.
We had a great starting point, a good distribution of people with a lot of different levels of comfort, which I think is totally understandable. So I'm really curious if we hopefully maybe change some minds and convince some people that maybe they might feel a little bit more comfortable, or at least they'd know how to talk to their oncology pharmacist to make sure they felt comfortable. Let's go ahead and close that poll and see how we're doing. Okay, so it looks like we still have about 2/3 of people who are responding, maybe about 70% feel somewhat comfortable or very comfortable. We do still have about 27% of people who said they're either very uncomfortable or somewhat uncomfortable. What do you think of that, Catherine?
I think that's reasonable. I almost think every single clinical trial needs to be looked at in the context of what would I do instead, and what's my alternative, and how much sense does this clinical trial make for me? I think if I had to answer this question, I think I'd be somewhat comfortable, and it totally depends. In the right situation, I'd be like, yes, sign me up for that trial. And in another one, I'd say, maybe this one isn't for me right now.
Yeah,
Hopefully that's
absolutely. No, I think that's totally fair. I think honestly, this is really where there's no right answer. The decision to participate in a clinical trial is such a personal decision. I think the goal of sessions like this is to sort of help you dispel myths so that you understand wholly what you're considering. And the answer may still be no, and that's totally okay.
So I want to end by telling you where you can find more information about cancer clinical trials. You can go to the HOPA website, hoparx.org/time-to-talk-diversity. And I want to make sure that you all know about clinicaltrials.gov. Many of you probably do already, but this is such a great resource. If you get a new diagnosis, you can look and see what trials are being run across the country for your diagnosis, and potentially reach out to maybe not your local center, but one that has a really specialized program somewhere else, and potentially can offer you some assistance to get there and receive fabulous care as part of a clinical trial.
Well, I'm gonna take just one or two questions that are being dropped into the chat. Thank you, everybody who's put some questions into the chat. I'm going to go through those. And one, Catherine, you just answered actually. One is, how are clinical trials communicated to our community? I think, one really great resource is that clinicaltrials.gov that Catherine just mentioned. It really is a repository of all the clinical trials that are taking place throughout the country. And you can filter it by what's close to you, for what type of cancer or disease you might be looking at. So it can really help you narrow down where trials are available. If you live close to a cancer treatment center, you may want to go to their website. I work at UNC. Jen and Catherine work at large cancer centers as well. If you go to the websites of those cancer centers, there's generally a link so you can search what clinical trials are available, which ones are recruiting patients, and how to contact them to see if you might be eligible for them as well. There's a really good question here. Do participants find out what researchers learn from studies that they participate in? What a great question.
I think that the answer varies. I think that this is an area of improvement for all of the research community. I think that we need to do better with this. Certainly, I encourage you to ask and say, will you share the results with me? I think sometimes results come out and, maybe you're in long-term follow-up and you're not seeing the provider necessarily that frequently and they may forget, or it's just maybe something that is not like necessarily common practice at your site. But again, that doesn't mean that's right. So again, feel free to take the ownership to ask, just because someone may forget to share it, but we should. And that's the right thing to do. It just may not always happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think sometimes it's there, but harder to find and not done in a community-friendly way so that, clinicaltrials.gov, everyone's required to post their results there eventually, but it could take many years until they're ready to do so. So definitely keep asking over time because it takes a while to compile that data.
I'll field one question that asks, what's the process of choosing who gets a placebo? Or if not a placebo, who gets assigned to what arm of a study? Is it a random selection? Actually, I'll punt that to one of you two first, and then I can add on to there. Does anybody want to take a first stab at what the process is?
It's I mean, usually nobody at the site knows. There are some studies where the pharmacists do know because we're doing the randomizing or we have to do a preparation. And so we'll only know, but I would say I only have a handful of studies like that. The majority of the time, the randomization is done through this like special website that randomizes the patient to their arm. And then we get what we call kit assignment. So it'll tell us dispense vial number 1, 2, 3, and really only the computer system and the sponsor knows what's in that vial. So a lot of the time, nobody at the site actually knows what the patient's getting.
Yeah, I would say the way trials are designed is to make sure that it's a fair comparison. They're trying to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So looking at patients who are similar and trying to make sure that they randomize them so that they're really able to say, if we see a difference, it's because of the drug treatment or it's because of what we did. It's not just random because we happen to choose these healthier people to receive this treatment and the unhealthier people to get a different treatment. So it's really highly structured to make sure that we can trust the results when we see them.
Yeah, and the computer system takes care of that. So it takes all those factors and then allocates patients based on that in the randomization scheme that they have.
The last question that I'll pose, it's an interesting question. Can you enter a clinical trial if maybe your doctor does not agree with it? And I think this really opens opportunity for patients. And I think this is where I would encourage patients to be strong advocates for their care. Your physicians and your care providers really should be working towards making sure that you know what your options are. I have had plenty of patients who've asked me, what would you do? And that's a really hard question because most of the time I say, I'm not you, but I can tell you what would go into my thinking. And that's a helpful way of posing it. So I think, if you have a difference of opinion with your care provider about what therapy you should look at or whether a trial is the right answer for you, it's always reasonable to say, like, could I talk to somebody else who might offer me a different opinion? And most oncologists that I know would be more than happy to have you talk to somebody else so that they make sure that they're doing right by you and giving you the information in a way that's helpful. I know we are over time, so Gerald and Linda.
Can I get a question in before we go? Because I can't put a Q&A in because I'm on the panel.
Of course.
But with the low percent of BIPOC people participating in clinical trials, how does whatever the clinical trial is trying to promote going to impact a low turnout of BIPOC people if they try to go through and get the same type of medication? Or how do you all handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably all have a different answer to it, but I mean, I guess I would say you really have to have a balanced conversation with the patient and say, this percentage of patients that enrolled are from the BIPOC community. And look at it that way, right? That's why we want more people to enroll. We want a greater diversity so that the providers and the patients both feel more comfortable looking at that data, saying, this is representative of me, or as the provider saying, this is representative of you as the patient. And we have greater confidence in what that data means for you in particular, because we know not all patients and, regardless of what the characteristic as race, ethnicity, gender, life experience are going to react or process medication the same way. And so that's why it's so important to us to have a diverse patient population so that we can feel more confident in that information.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Jen. I think it's absolutely spot on. One of the things I would add to it is there's also ongoing evaluation of drugs. So after a clinical trial closes, we may find that a drug gets approved for treatment, and we might start using it in more patients, including a higher number of minority and BIPOC cancer patients. And we continuously look at that data on how those patients do. And there have been times where after a year or two, it's called post-marketing surveillance. They look at the outcomes of those trials going on 2 or 3 years later, and they say, hey, now that we've treated more people from a variety of backgrounds and different genetics and different races, we're starting to see some differences. And that can help inform how we change treatments moving forward. But to Dr. Murphy's point, it would be so much better if we could incorporate those patients up front, so we didn't wait longer to find those answers.
Mhm.
Well, I know we are over time. Are there any last questions? I think I've hit most of the questions that came across in the chat. All of us are available to answer questions. I am, again, so thankful as a North Carolina native now. I've lived here for 25 years, so I guess that makes that makes this home. I'm so thankful to the Charlotte Post Publishing Company, to the Triangle Tribune, to help to allow us the space and time. I hope this is the start of a relationship that we can continue. And if you want to learn more, please visit some of those QR codes. We're really grateful for the time and space you had this evening. Thanks so much, everybody. It's been a pleasure spending some time with you this evening. Thanks again to our speakers, Dr. Kinsman and Dr. Murphy, for sharing your expertise tonight. And everybody have a great evening. And if you're here in North Carolina, please stay warm. It is cold out there. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Great presentation. Thank you.
And so we say thank you for attending our webinar, Turn Hope into Outcomes, Time to Talk Diversity in Clinical Trials. We had great presenters, moderated excellent, and stay tuned for future discussions. Thank you for participating with the Charlotte Post and the Triangle Tribune webinar this evening.